You kind of like write off the word deep state. Like, what is a deep state? I don't know who it is there.
Yeah,
Like,
I don't use that term for that reason.
what is the term that you would use for it? Because I do think that you're tapping into a feeling and sensation a lot of Americans have, where they're disillusioned with government and the people in control, and they feel like their desires are not being met by candidates. It's probably why you've had so much success, because you're speaking to a lot of the frustrations that Americans have.
Yeah.
So what is that term they would use for the powers that be that are not elected, but able to exert immense force and control, i.e. the people at the CIA?
I think Vivek's term is pretty good as a managerial class. I mean, there are entities within the government that, are actually dictating a lot of this stuff.
Like whom?
I would say probably most, particularly with our foreign policy, the Atlantic Council. And the Atlantic Council has, just go look at who's on it. There's 6 former CIA chiefs on the Atlantic Council.
But these are elected officials or?
No.
And who appoints them?
They're appointed by invitation.
Who is inviting?
The Atlantic Council.
What I'm trying to understand is, like, how do these positions of power, where do they come from? Like, who creates them?
How does the Atlantic Council even get power?
Yeah.
What?
How does the Atlantic Council even get power? Can you just break this down for us, simplest possible terms?
Like, how does this get started? Who starts it?
There are a lot of different centers of power, and I'm just saying this is one of them because it really, it dictates U.S. foreign policy, and it dictates policy in NATO. These people are all highly respected. They tell the president, Vladimir Putin is a crazy person. He's about to invade all of Europe. We need to be over there, and we need to go to war with him. And they not only influence the U.S. government, but they are the primary body that influences NATO. There's other things, the Council on Foreign Relations, and then there are panels, across the government that are made up of industry people within who are, who have, and you can look at them in every agency, in FDA, it's called VRPAC, and the CDC is called ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And if you look at the people who sit on it, they're all people who are profiting from, this, not from making people healthier, but from making, from a sick country, and a country that's constantly at war, and a country that is doing the opposite of what its ideals say it's supposed to be doing.
How would you stop corporate influence in government institutions?
Well, the worst thing that happened in terms of corporate influence was the Citizens United case, and it's hard to fix that. And just so that you know what Citizens United is, we lost democracy at one point in our history in the 1880s and 1890s. Our country was being run by corporate plutocracy, and it was John D. Rockefeller, the Mellons, the Carnegies, the Fricks, the Whitneys. And they all sat on interlocking boards for the Sugar Trust, the Rail Trust, the Steel Trust, the Oil Trust, et cetera. And at that time, there was no direct election of senators. So the senators were not chosen by the public. They were chosen by the legislatures. The legislatures were completely owned, the state legislatures, by Congress. By these guys. In fact, it was said that the only legislatures that you could not purchase, that could not be purchased, was the Pennsylvania state legislature, because John D. Rockefeller owned them all and he wasn't selling any.
Wow.
And so they would then pick the senators, and everybody from top to bottom was chosen by this group.
Didn't Rockefeller bail out the entire country with a check? Didn't you tell me this story? One of these guys, the U.S. needed money, and he was like, "Yeah, I'll just write you a check."
The different time, but maybe during, I think a bunch of them actually came together. This is right before the Great Depression. They just dumped a bunch of money in the stock market to try to regulate it, but different than what we're talking about. But go on.
So then you had a confluence of these extraordinary events that happened. You had the rise in the countryside of the populist movement, which was democratic.
Can I just say one thing real quick? So when you have these people, the billionaires, the aristocracy, owning the legislative branch, they're dictating the laws in the country, essentially.
Yeah, they were dictating the laws, and they were also dictating the personnel. But I'll just do this very briefly.
I mean, so
You had two big movements that happened. One was Republican, one was Democrat. Populists in the countryside, they were organizing farmers, which were then a huge part of the population, the progressives in the city. And you had suddenly appear all these muckraking journalists who really changed America. Ida Tarbell, Upton Sinclair, Sinclair Lewis, and many others. They were writing for a magazine called McClure's, and they started doing exposés on John D. Rockefeller and all the other robber barons. And America, everybody was reading those magazines. Everybody, the whole middle class was reading it, and there's a sense of indignation. And then you had one guy came along, Teddy Roosevelt, who was a member of the plutocracy, and he wasn't intimidated by him, and he got elected president and started to dismantle him, and they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, and he broke up the Standard Oil, the biggest company in the world.
Yeah.
They passed the 40-hour work week. They let unions start to organize. They gave women the vote. They passed
Frustrating.
Corporate income tax for the first time. They passed graduated income tax for the first time. The most important bill they passed was in 1908. They passed a law that made it illegal for corporations to give to federal political candidates.
Yeah.
So that stood for 102 years.
And then Citizens United.
And then Citizens United, this very business-friendly Supreme Court, in 2010 came and said that donations are free speech.
Yeah.
They're protected by the First Amendment, and you can't do anything to interfere with them. And that's the court we got today.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to fix that part of it, which is the systemic part, because it unleashed the tsunami. So I'm running against Biden and Trump, and both of them are going to have $2 billion.
So just to clarify why this is difficult, you have a situation before where these billionaires or corporations, if you will, the owners of these corporations are dictating the laws because they own the legislative branch of government. They own Congress, right? Teddy dismantles it. 102 years later, Citizens United essentially allows corporations to fund candidates. And now it's almost impossible to beat a corporately funded candidate.
Yeah.
So you're back in the same system that Teddy had to break. Real quick question about Teddy. Is that why Teddy kind of has a shaky reputation historically? Like, have they tried to smear him a little bit? Like, he's some weirdo that likes to go out to, where was it? Hang out in the forest for months at a time.
I think he's actually, according to public polls, one of the most popular presidents in history. I mean, progressives don't like him.
Of course.
Because he was a warmonger. And he was an American imperialist, and he bullied his way around, the Philippines, built the Panama Canal, and and then took over Cuba.
Right.
He was the one, they sent people down to help with the Cuban insurrection against Spain. But in the end, he told the Cubans, oh, and by the way, we're keeping Guantanamo Bay, which is your biggest port. So that's how we got Guantanamo Bay.
Shout out to Teddy.
And he did the same thing. He took over the Philippines and Guam, and so people think of him as imperialist, but I think genuinely his reputation has withstood the test of time.